So we've been talking a lot about data collection in general, and I'd like to ask the next panelists, Deon and Mejriim, about their experiences gathering data by and about a particular kind of segment of a population or a particular element of SOGI. And Deon is the TVT Regional Coordinator for Africa and the Middle East, and they've been working on advocacy with grassroots organizations and groups at the regional, national, and international level. Deon focuses on research and data collection, and they have experience working with the Global Fund to ensure representation by key populations. So, Deon, can you please tell us more about your research itself and how it is used as an advocacy tool?
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for the organizers and my fellow panelists. I'm going to start by presenting the project for those who are not familiar with the TVT. So TVT stands for Transrespect versus Transphobia, and it's a worldwide project. It's an ongoing comparative, qualitative, quantitative research project initiated and established by Transgender Europe, and it has three focuses. It has the trans murder monitoring, that systematically monitors, collects, and analyzes reports of homicides of trans and gender diverse people worldwide. We have the legal and social mapping that follows a specific methodology available online for anyone who wants to consult it. And we have a country survey that responds to the persistent needs of evidence-based comparative data. So to reply to the advocacy question, the TVT team believes that in the context of criminalization, pathologization, and murders against trans and gender diverse people, data collection becomes a crucial advocacy tool. It documents in a systematic way the human rights violations against our communities. And data collection and analysis come indeed to show that SOGI issues are not artificial, as we heard the past days. It comes to also reflect that communities' realities on the ground are real, and to make policy and decision makers aware of those realities. And to hold accountable those responsible of the human rights violations, especially when we speak about hostile political figures and states. Data collection has made significant change as it captures the community's exact facts and needs. And that's why it's very important to highlight that data collection made by the communities for the communities themselves give the interpretation and the analytical process a whole different significance. And let's not forget also that we are the experts on the ground, and we have the networks that produces the data and transfer them authentically and responsibly. I would also love to underline a few challenges that we face in the research process. Thank you, Victor, for mentioning the lack of resource, because that's a permanent issue that we face when we collect data and when we try to work with them, and it always persists in the way. Also, the lack of states' support in the process. That's why we believe that the independent expert mandate has a particular influence on getting data, especially the qualitative one that's always, let's say, ignored when it doesn't include the quantitative part. Right. It makes it, by the mandate, heard for, how to say it, for the policymakers. And because when the mandate is going to transfer those data produced by the communities, also it's in a reliable way, and that's going to help the state and the policymaker to design programs that reply and respond to our exact needs. There's also another part that we struggle with, and here I address to the state representatives. Researchers and people working on data collection need to reach out to different communities around the world to accomplish their missions. So if states don't provide visas and liberty of circulation to those researchers, especially people from the global south, then the process is going to be interrupted and incomplete, and it's always an issue that we face constantly, and that's why, for example, and to refer to your question, we use technology, but technology doesn't give us the exact information that we need and data, especially when we discuss about cybersecurity and digital security, and it's very problematic, especially when we're going to use specific platforms. So sometimes researchers and data collection people need to circulate, especially those working from the global south. For example, I work in Africa and the Middle East. States require visa from those people to go in those states. I guess I'm over time, sorry. Thank you.
You're perfectly on time. I don't know what would have given you any impression that you might be going over. So thank you very much for those insights and the challenges you set out there, which are very concrete as well. Julia Ehrt is the Director of Programs at ILGA, and before joining ILGA, she was the Executive Director of Transgender Europe, is a member of the Steering Committee of the International Trans Fund, and a board member of the Association for Women's Rights and Development, AWID. So, Julia, we've been talking a lot about where we are now in terms of research methodologies, and I wonder if you could give us a sense of how this process has evolved in terms of ILGA's work with the state-sponsored homophobia report and the trans legal mapping report.
Thank you, Helen, with pleasure. So I'll speak about the state-sponsored homophobia report of ILGA, and this is not going to be about the findings or about the substance. Maybe I'll come to that in the end if I have time, but this is about the evolution of this report. Kind of a journey from criminalization to constitutional protection. We started in 2007 with the first state-sponsored homophobia report. Had 51 pages, and it was, I quote, an impressive collection of laws. It contained laws from 85 countries that criminalized consensual same-sex activity, and that is it. This is how it looked like, bone dry, a legal document. I mean, a very useful advocacy tool still. However, and produced by ILGA, I mean, with contributions from across the world, but mostly written up by ILGA. And I mean, over the last 12 years, we've progressed significantly away from that on like 2 dimensions. So the one dimension is who contributes to that report. Previously, it was written mostly by ILGA, but here you can see the timeline. We started off with a black letter law analysis. We still have that. But then we added a list of countries, still drafted by basically the office. But then in 2011, ILGA decided that we would give more voices to our board members and to other scholars. So we added regional forwards to all our, speaking to all our world regions. And then in 2015, we expanded on those forwards, but putting in what is called global perspectives, and that gives context to what is happening in terms of the law in the region that has a global relevance. And then finally, in the 2019 report, we added additional information, graphics, and a whole new section on the international human rights law. And if you look at, this is the evolution of authors, of the number of authors in our report from 2011 to 2019. So that is not the people who contribute and do legal research on the national level. There's like hundreds of them who monitor the national level developments. Those are only actual authors who write an article in the state-sponsored homophobia report, and you can see how there's a strong evolution towards making this an actual multifaceted, community-owned report. So that was the one evolution. But there's as well an evolution in terms of the substance of the report. So I'm coming back to the black letter law, which was focusing on criminalization in the beginning. But in 2013, we thought, we want to go away from a naming and shaming report towards a report that as well researches good and best practice. So we added 2 new sections which researches protection and recognition in the 193 member states of the UN, again to evolve that concept from only looking at criminalization as one of the important root causes for discrimination violence, but as well to be able to showcase this is the positive developments. This is where countries protect persons on grounds of their sexual orientation. This is where countries recognize civil unions or marriage equality for gay and lesbian couples. And those were and just to conclude on this evolution, this is how the report looks today in 2009. That's just like one page, which gives on the right the legal information on the various member states, in this case in Africa. On the left gives contextual information and graphics, so to make this a comprehensive report. Let me use 30 more seconds to quickly say some of our findings. So here you see the number of countries that decriminalize, and you can see a clear, over time, a clear decrease from 140 member states criminalizing in the late 60s to 69. We've heard that number earlier. We have 26 countries, states in the world that recognize same-sex marriage, and we have 74 member states that protect on grounds of sexual orientation in employment, 9 out of them in the Constitution. That's it. And this is the map that we developed that brings all that legal information together. The red countries criminalize, and the blue countries protect from discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you for all of those nice pictures to distract us for a while. So now I'd like to turn to you, Micah. And Micah Grzywnowicz is the International Advocacy Advisor at RFSL, the Swedish Federation for LGBTQ Rights, and leads the organization's UN advocacy work with a specific focus on the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Micah is a member of the UNDP Civil Society Advisor Committee since 2017. So Micah, thinking back to what Victor said and what others have raised in terms of giving perhaps more weight, more legitimacy to some of the data that's been gathered, can you tell us more about how the UN can and is creating tools and guidelines also for data related to sexual orientation and gender identity?
Great. Thank you, Helen. And it's quite a luxury to actually speak at the end of this panel, because now pretty much what I will say will touch upon so many of your points. So thanks for putting me at the end, Helen. And I want to speak about one tool that is coming directly from the UN, but also to look at where it came from. And this is the call from the Agenda 2030 to create data revolution that Victor started with. And I would like to challenge that it hasn't happened yet. We are on the way, and we're creating a lot of tools, materials, discussions like this, but we are on the way. And hopefully, this discussion also push us forwards to that. And in all that we've been discussing, and what the Agenda 2030 is asking us for is to create reliable, timely, and disaggregated data. So I think that fits perfectly what all my colleagues said. And in that context, as you could hear, there are gaps that we know exist when it comes to collecting data around LGBTI inclusion. It's not consistently collected. Sometimes we cannot compare it across countries, and sometimes the data is anecdotal. So it comes from communities, and sometimes, or very often, it's not seen as credible. So in that context, UNDP in 2015, when the Agenda 2030 was adopted, used kind of an excuse of that new framework to try to create a new tool for collecting data and to create LGBTI inclusion index. And that was an exercise, a bit of a teamwork across both the UN agencies and civil society across different regions. Collectively, we came up with 5 dimensions that are important, or were said that are important for communities. And they were focused on political and civic participation, education, health, personal security and violence, economic well-being. And some of the discussions that we've had for the last 4 years, and I'm looking at Alex because also Alex was part of the process, we discussed how to collect data. What about the language? You can see the title of the index is LGBTI. It focuses on populations, but we knew very, very well that this doesn't talk to all experiences of all our communities. So, since we had to communicate somehow, we said that this is a placeholder to make the language as broad as possible when we implement the index. So one of the examples how it has been done so far was, for instance, when the World Bank was collecting data in Thailand and in the Balkans, with the communication, in the communication with civil society in the communities, they decided what language to use to reach people that we are interested in and gather all the lived experiences. I have 1 minute left, probably less now. We have, in that context, we created 51 indicators that will help us collect the data. It's a huge number of indicators. I can see my colleagues smile. It's a very interesting project to do. And what was important is to make indicators that are relevant for our communities, depending on the context, that are possible to collect and must be understood for the local community. So that's why the cross-regional consultation. And I think, yes, I'm clicking so many things at the same time. I guess 2 things that I want to say before around challenges apart from the language and quality of the data and who collects data. One thing is about funding. My colleagues mentioned that. We have a lot of information. We are locked sometimes by lack of funding, so that's one issue. Another thing is around who is collecting data. Where possible, states need to do that, and UNDP, together with us, is looking for pilot countries, how to do it, and how to analyze what is working, what is not working, and how we can do it together. And I know that Victor is also working with UNDP on guidelines on how to do it ethically and safe for our communities. Stop now, yes, stop.
Thank you. So for the remainder of the time, I will open the floor for questions for the second group of panelists, but of course for everyone as a whole. I also, of course, welcome any states who would like to intervene. I see one question at the back. Okay, we have lots of questions. So starting at the back.
Hi, I'm Marissa from Barbados with the organization Equals. I have to go, but I want to quickly ask, how do you continue to do research on a population who is exhausted in terms of being researched and not seeing a difference in change of legislation or even simply access to services within countries? How do you encourage the community to continue to be researched? Basically, yeah. Because we have that issue within the Caribbean, so I'm just wondering.
Thanks. I'll take a few more. Ksenia at the back, Rashima, and then yourselves.
Hello, my name is Ksenia. I'm from ILGA World, and I'm a senior officer on women and UN advocacy. So I work with data, but also with women, and my question is about gender dimension. So from my experience, sometimes it's difficult to find disaggregated data related to lesbian, bisexual, queer women specifically, or LGBTI women. And there is a question about data on human rights violations, but also question about scientific or medical or epidemiological data related to this population, because they are not, or we are not considered as a part of key populations, but at the same time there should be some problems, I guess. And my question to Victor is, do you raise in your work this question of scientific or medical or epidemiological data, and particularly when it comes to LGBTQ women? And also questions to Alex and Micah, because I've heard that you had disaggregated data on SOGI or LGBTI, and do you have any specific data on LB women's populations? And maybe to everyone, if you have any best practices examples of collection of data on LGBTQ women or LGBTI women. Thanks.
It's great because Ksenia kind of asked very similarly my questions, which were that a lot of funding, as we've heard from the panel, is extremely limited for LGBTI groups globally. And we know that on top of that, funding that is earmarked for research and data is almost non-existent. And when it is, it's very much tied to public health and a public health framework and perspective and key populations. And so that's at least my experience coming from Thailand and from Southeast Asia. So while we already have limited data. We have very limited data on lesbian, queer, bisexual women in particular. And these are also groups that are completely underfunded and undercapacitated, both in regards to being researched and doing the researching. So I guess specifically, how do we push a research and data agenda that covers invisibilized populations, recognizing this lack of resources and capacity? And also, how do we encourage states to look at data collection from a non-public health perspective?
Thank you. I'll ask one last question, and then we'll have some answers and then come back. Thanks.
Roger Carsons, Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. That's a mouthful. I'd like to say thanks for inviting us here today, and thanks for the opportunity to participate and ask a question. Thank you to the panelists. And we want to say that we believe that the independent experts report is very important. You know, learning how to collect all this data and getting it out there is going to help us solve a lot of problems, or at least start wrestling with some of the solutions. So we're very grateful for all the hard work that you're doing. We also want to let you know that we'd like to be a steadfast partner as you go forward and try to collect some of this data. And with that in mind, I'd like to know, what do the panelists see in terms of regions or areas that you need some more, I guess I could say, technical support or assistance, and where are opportunities where the United States could contribute?
Thank you very much for that. I'd ask first if Micah, Julia, or Deon have any answers, and then turn to the rest.
I mean, I can around Ksenia's question around the disaggregated data on LGBTI women. Specifically, what we said in the index is that it cannot keep putting people in a box. So we cannot collect data on LGBTI because it doesn't say anything. Each of the population, LGBTI plus, any other identity that our communities choose to identify with, has very different experiences. So we cannot keep putting people in a box. So the index was very, very purposefully making sure that the populations are disaggregated, and that's why it's 51 indicators. Because if we were focusing on the collective of our communities, it would be much less. So I think, as soon as we start collecting data, it will show if it works or not. And one more thing around that, we also, when preparing the indicators, we divided them into 3 different tiers, how available the data is right now. And what we said is that we cannot keep reaching out to sources of data that are the easiest available. So, we heard Grindr or any other, dating system and so on, because some of our communities are not there, so we cannot collect data from there. So we need to start coming up with new ideas, how to reach the harder to reach communities, which I don't believe they are harder to reach. We just didn't put enough effort to actually creating tools to reach them.
I'd like to respond with pleasure to the question from Roger from the US State Department on the gaps. I think there's like 3 huge gaps, and as you could see, ILGA, in the state-sponsored homophobia research, we research illegal data, which in a certain way is the easiest to research. Still, I mean, this is a huge task for an NGO, researching 193 countries. But one of the big gaps is data on the experience of discrimination violence across the globe that is kind of comparable of SOGI, on grounds of SOGI-esque, as well as opinions towards persons of diverse SOGI-esque. So that's gap 1. Gap 2 clearly is specific data on trans issues, both legally and in terms of experience. I mean, there's the Transrespect versus Transphobia project has collected a lot of data, but the data available is, and I quote Richter here, fragmented and has its limitations. We don't have data that covers all member states of the UN, and that's kind of the second big gap. I think what is needed here is to incapacitate the trans community to support the data collection as such. And then the third gap is clearly data on sex characteristics or intersex persons, which is basically non-existent across the world.
Very quick response. Yes, we have data disaggregated by both sexual orientation and gender identity. We have data on lesbian women that includes cis and trans women, so it's also disaggregated within the group of lesbian women. We have data on bisexual women, both cis and trans. We have data on trans women of all sexual orientations. And it was absolutely important for us to be able to present the data in that way. I think also, in terms of regions that are a gap, I would say we need more research, especially in West Africa. And I think similar to what Julia said about capacitating trans populations to do the research, I think we ideally want to capacitate local academics or states to do the work with local organizations. Because as we see again and again, the contestation of research often happens around nationalist discourses of what is deemed African or un-African on the continent, and to have local researchers do the work makes a huge difference in the way the work is being taken up and taken seriously.
Two quick words. The first one is, of course, the issue of data of groups that are even within information on sexual orientation and gender identity underrepresented even within those groups connects very strongly to your point about internalized prejudice. And I think in this case one needs to actually just place the word bisexual on the table, because this is a population, a community of peoples that is actually completely underrepresented, but also because there is enormous prejudice and preconceptions in relation to this community. So at the end of the day, all of this requires is a constant demand to oneself to deconstruct entitlement, privilege, and preconceptions that nobody in the world is immune to. We all come with our preconceptions. And so the question is, how do we all get into a mindset where we constantly challenge what we know so that we can actually develop better approaches? Just wanted to say a very quick word. For me, the most important thing, I wish I conveyed this when I presented my report, is to convey how heartbreaking it is to get into a phone line and hear an organization saying, we wept for hours when we burned 20 years of data because the government told us, that it was going to pass a legislation and they were going to prosecute us for keeping pornographic material because we had data on sexual orientation and gender identity. And we burned 20 years of data and we wept for hours, and I wanted to weep with them for hours as well, because I can imagine that this is something. But there's a question there you mentioned about historical value of data and quantitative data, and I just wanted to kind of bring the point about the investment that is required, because the more we actually develop these approaches, the more we will understand that certain data will be needing to adhere to certain ethical and quality standards. So for example, how much data is gathered there that actually complies with conditions of informed consent that are actually acceptable for research organizations in the global north that will be financing exercises of data for research? And can we go back 20 years and actually find those conditions of quality and ethical standards in that data? I see a lot of people going like this, and I know why, because no, we can't. And so the question is, how do we match types of data and its limitations to purposes? So data can be used for advocacy, it can be used for research, it can be used as evidence before courts. And we can actually match limitations to certain types of use. And I'm hoping that this is part of what actually gets done, and that we can establish some standards. But a notion needs to be there. This is a sector in which strong investment is needed. And it will not be the typical type of looking at programming. It's going to require significant investment to produce data of the quality and level that we need. So my call is, of course, for all of us to develop this together in a way where actually we don't need to weep 20 years from now about what we are producing today.
I just want to echo what my colleague Alex has been saying in terms of regions that lack investment in data. not only West Africa, but I'd go for the whole African continent. We lack data on North Africa as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. We don't have data on trans people in Libya. We don't have data on trans people in Mauritania. We don't have, in the Middle East, for example, there's absolutely no data on trans people. So this is what the TVT project is trying to do, is to build slowly data on trans people in the Middle East. But then we have a lot of problems collecting those data. First, lack of resources, as I said, and second, the context in the Middle East is very challenging, as we all know. So we try to find our ways, but a huge investment is needed in those regions, in my opinion.
So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that for once we're not being chased out of a room during a side event and actually go for another round of questions. I see Simran, I see Arvind. Good. Okay, starting with Simran.
I think just wanted to flag there is one more issue. We are talking about the resources, we are talking about the difficulties of gathering the data, the qualitative, the quantitative, the XYZ data. There's also one more big challenge of how we are disseminating the data. And Victor, you would agree with me, the World Bank study done on India, the cost of homophobia and transphobia on the country's GDP is, I mean, when it was presented to the world, XYZ data were removed, and we are still trying to figure out how we can, produce it to the larger context. I wish this data could have helped us 3 years back during the country's argument in the court while scrapping the Section 377, which was criminalizing the same-sex behavior. However, we got it, but I wish that study could have been a X factor to the court's decision. But there are, such kind of examples, there are many examples, and those are not being actually disseminated. There is a larger challenge towards dissemination of such kind of studies also.
At the back of the room.
Yeah, thanks to Julia in particular for the analysis of the ILGA report. I think it's a very significant resource, and people have used it around the world. To give an example again, in the Indian context, we use the ILGA World maps in terms of to put forward the case for decriminalization, saying which side do you want to be on India? Do you want to be on the side of your blue line or the red line, as it were, And I think the report is, as you very well documented, the report has evolved fantastically, and I think the latest report is a really excellent document. So the only suggestion I have is it possible to also publish it not just online, but also offline? So for example, libraries such as this should have a copy of that report. It should begin to also influence the academic world. Why is it only a resource which activists use? It should be something which academics use as well, because such a significant and excellent piece of work. And the other comment I have is, I understand, obviously from my comments till now, I understand completely the role that data plays. But I think also to make the point that sometimes things are also beyond the concept of data. Something like prejudice cannot always be rooted out by an appeal to reason alone. So I think to keep in mind that while it's very important to have a data-led approach, it's also very important to have an approach rooted in maybe the arts or maybe movies or maybe other ways of approaching the issue. To keep in mind always that there are multiple routes towards attacking the issue of discrimination and violence.
Thank you. I'll take one last question.
Thank you very much. I'll take advantage of the extra time just to introduce myself. I'm Cindy Nelson from the Mission of Canada, and we're pleased to be a co-sponsor of today's event. I'd just first like to thank the independent expert for bringing this topic to the Human Rights Council. I think it's very important, and I think it was very eye-opening for all of us, and will indeed go a long way to helping us rethink our own policies of how we approach LGBTI people at home, and also to challenge prejudice. One of the threads that really struck me is despite the risks of collecting data in criminalized environments, how you had the very positive example that you shared, Alex, about how are you able to contribute to the case in Botswana. But also, as you pointed out, Jeffrey, how it was the lack of data that is now a barrier, and how it's going to be the work in collecting the data that could be helpful there in the future. I just want to touch on, Victor, you just prompted a thought for me in your last comment about about preservation of data and where data is at risk, and what efforts are being taken, with the little data that does exist into protecting it, and perhaps if there's secondary locations where it can be stored so it's not under threat. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I think I might go down the line and see what comments there are, if that works. Alex, you're good?
Then I'll respond quickly to the two questions, one from Arvin and one from the person who left in the beginning. So the question on publishing the state-sponsored homophobia report offline, we would love to do that, but there's a financial limitation that we are running into. And the same goes actually for translation. I mean, the scope of the report is great, the size is fantastic, but I mean, translation increases with the number of pages. And there's again a financial, limitation. It's a hard question. Do we translate in other languages, or do we make physical copies? That's a hard one. So if there's money in the room, I'd be very happy to have a conversation. And then the person who left asked, how do we encourage our communities to continue doing research? I think that's a pivotal question. And I think the answer to that is, to some extent, that we as NGOs do not research for the sake of doing research, but we do research for the purpose, for changing the world to the better. We're doing research to produce tools for our advocacy, and that is the state-sponsored homophobia report. That is the report that ILGA puts out. It's called the Trans-Legal Mapping Report, which is just going into the second round of research, where we try to where we learn from the 10 years of experience with state-sponsored homophobia and do not replicate some of those shortfalls. And I think that is the bottom line, to produce advocacy tool through research that eventually help us change the world.
Sorry, Helen. No, I think I wanted to comment on what you were saying around, what data in the end is published and what happens with the rest and who decides. And since you mentioned the World Bank, and then since that report on India, the World Bank, I mentioned that data collection on Thailand and a couple of Balkan countries. This was the triangular kind of cooperation, because the data collection projects were ordered by the state, so the client state, and it was a really close cooperation with the civil society organizations, and they agreed on language, what data comes out. It was not the state who was publishing the data. Mm-hmm. So it was all in control of civil society. So I think, yeah.
I was a civil society organization there in 2013 doing the World Bank study for India.
I'm not referring to the Indian report. I'm just saying that in 2018 the reports were done in different ways. So hopefully there was a learning process happening for the institution as well. So I'm just saying that maybe the process changed, hopefully, and I just wanted to share that was a different experience. From what I know.
Just two very quick points. Although, of course, that's a very complicated question about preservation of data, but there's an attempt in the report. It's imperfect, and hopefully it can be perfected over time, to recognize that there are different levels to this. One are the legislative protections that can be put in place, and that's, of course, the prime responsibility of states. And, of course, there's good practice everywhere, but the standard is, at the moment, I believe, the level of protection at the European level that is being implemented and trickling down. There's also good practice that is being developed all the time, and that is matched by technology possibilities. And in this, I will, of course, not go into specifics for reasons of security, but I found 2 or 3 very interesting examples of organizations that, for example, had decided not to take their data in any way, shape, or form online, because they know that the second that you're online, it's vulnerable. So they had decided, as a matter of fact, in one case, to continue doing paper, because this was the easiest way in a very difficult environment to maintain absolute compartmentalization of the risk. So the thing is, it doesn't always seem that the best technology offers the best solution in terms of security, even though at the moment it seems to be that the medium level, which is, for example, laptop, isolated, maintaining the data is a possibility. I saw two examples, again, I won't go too much into specifics, of organizations that maintained an agreement with other entities where physically data would be actually taken once a month and would actually be stored in safe locations under very strict protocols, anonymization, and so on and so forth. So good practice exists out there, and it's been developed by all of you. I mean, the point of the matter is that this is just the ingenuity of civil society at ensuring that risk is managed in the best way possible. Two words in relation to this that allow me to connect with a question that was raised before. I think the key is to ask communities, who do you trust with your data? And why do you trust that group or that entity with your data? And what Catherine, Alice, myself, we have been finding in this whole exercise is that, for example, peer gathering of data is actually, of course, a lot more effective because people trust their peers. And the answer will be, why do you trust them? Well, because we know they're going to safeguard my security. So alliances should be built so that, for example, if we're talking about lesbian, bisexual women, trans women, there should be alliances built. But then there needs to be also then a recognition that this is not only activism, this is expertise. And expertise needs to be recognized within the programming threads. So there's a whole deconstruction to make of our own thinking of these issues and how we understand advocacy. Final thing in relation to dynamics is organizations need to be, I believe, I saw a lot of examples of risk, and in some cases badly managed risk, where organizations have actually very little limitations to what they report to donors. And in very many cases, the demands that organizations make in terms of anonymization and abstractization, that's not a word, but I just invented, of data. We need to have those tools, ensuring, and of course, on the other side of the equation, donor entities need to have that self-regulation of knowing what is exactly the limits of what they should ask for, so that risk is managed in the very best way. But to me, the question that I would ask each and every time that I want to improve data collection is, who would you trust and why? And I think the answer to that is kind of the Ariadne thread that would take us out of the maze.
For the dissemination question, just to emphasize what Julia has been saying, because, and from a community perspective, I've seen a lot of, for example, trans communities go into universities, presenting their data, discussing with academics, doing their best to ensure that the data is being disseminated in the best way possible, in the best possible way, and to make the best outreach. But it's still the same problem. Academic institutions are not always located in the same regions. The discussion, for example, when we speak about trans rights and trans data, when we want to discuss it with the APA, the American Psychology Association, it needs money. So we always go to the same vicious circle about lack of resources, and especially translation-wise, as Julia said, it's very challenging, it's very complicated, so yeah.
Thank you all very much. I'll bring this session to a close now, and I think it was Victor said that this is in some ways the beginning of a conversation, but I think it's also clear from the other panelists as well that this is an ongoing conversation and that a lot has changed over time. And we do know that there are some very serious challenges. There are gaps, there's a lack of resources, power dynamics, serious risks, but we also know that that this research and data collection is essential, and we're creating new tools, creative ways of gathering this information to try and respond to some of those challenges. We do need principles. We need to bring together some of this, the lessons learned and the expertise that is out there, and as you say, treat it as genuine expertise. We need to build the capacity of the communities who are gathering this data, not only to gather it, but then also, as Julia says, to ensure that it leads to impact on the ground. And data collection research is not the only tool you'll be using, but it is a very powerful one. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again to the co-sponsors, and thank you for all the fantastic questions and answers. Thanks.
And thank you to our moderator. Thank you to our moderator who actually managed that we have a conversation and discussion in this space. Thanks, very well done.